Hi everybody. Hope everyone's doing well, stuck at home and finding things to do. I know artists are certainly always stuck at home, or at least I am, since my studio is here at home. So this is my home studio where I do a lot of my work, all my work really. And today I'm going to do a demo of painting of some rocks. I was really inspired by some time I spent this last summer in Maine painting rocks, and I painted a lot of them. If you've seen the show Time to Linger that's currently at the Providence Art Club, you can check it out online. There are lots of rocks. I think half the paintings in the show for me are all rocks. So I'm going to show you a little demo today about how I paint rocks, and let's get started. So I have just a quarter sheet of rough 300-pound watercolor paper. That's what I always use. I really like that. Taped to a board. I have my paints here. I have, oh boy, I have a big palette with lots of paints, but I primarily use cobalt blue, Antwerp blue. I use raw sienna. I use brown madder, rose madder, burnt umber. And I do have French ultramarine on here. I also have some burnt sienna and cerulean. So we'll see if I get into those or not. I don't always, but for painting rocks, I use purple. I'll show you the image I'm going to do. This is the image I'm using as my guide, and I've already drawn, loosely sketched on here what I'm going to be painting. It's not so much an exact replica. In fact, it's pretty loose, just lots of different lines, but it does give me a guide. So as I'm following along, this was actually part of a larger image, and I just sort of found the little composition I wanted to try today. Hopefully, there's some of the colors I really like here. I see lots of warm colors with cool shadows, which I think is really interesting. Probably going to leave out those back rocks there, but we'll see how it goes. Something else I have in addition to my paints, my paper, an image to paint from, is a credit card. This is actually an old gift card. And I use this to scrape away a lot when I'm painting, and you'll see what happens as I go with the rocks. And another reason why the drawing is only a reference and this image is only really a reference for color and to help with some shadows is because once I start getting the paint on here, you'll see how I start pretty loose. And by using this credit card to scrape away, different patterns emerge in the rocks. And so sometimes I just follow what happens on the page and the painting as I go. So let's get started. I have created a horizon line here. So, sorry, the horizon's going to really be outside of the image. So I'm just going to start with some water, a wash of water that I'm going to put in the background, and then get started on the color for the rocks. So here we go. I'm going to start with a sort of a medium-sized mop. This is an Escoda brush. And for the water back here, I'm mostly going to use cobalt. So I'm going to get together a nice bit of juicy wash of cobalt. Sometimes I add Antwerp blue into my water. I do think water tends to be a little bit greenish. So I'm just going to start, see if I can get the bead. Oh, well, that's okay. Don't worry about that. It's all gonna come together. I do have a nice bead going down here. So I'm just going to continue the bead. So the bead is when the paint drops down and forms a bead all along there, and then you just pick it up with your next stroke. And I don't have a hard line here, but I am going to follow a bit of a rock line. This particular painting does not have any wave crashing. When I do add the waves, then I'll leave a lot more space of white. But for this, I'm just going to loosely leave it that way. I'll give this a quick rinse. I'll probably have to darken up that water later on, but for right now, that just gives me a good place to start. And often what I do too is when I have drips like that and some good paint color I don't want to lose, especially in water, it's nice to create a variety of a variety of just different value. So instead of wasting that drip that was down there, pulling it up, I'm just going to let it kind of bleed in. I am seeing that some of this, I don't really like some of these shapes here, but the rocks that are up against the water are going to be darker value than the water, so it should be fine. It shouldn't matter too much about that edge there. And like I said, I might have to go back in and darken up the water, and in fact, most likely I will. Okay, we got a little blossom there. That's fine. Again, I'm gonna have to go over the water again. Okay, so for this first stage, I'm still using my Escoda mop. I'm going to create little puddles of color here on my palette. My first one is going to be raw sienna. So I have a little pool of my raw sienna here. And once I get these pools of color, it's a lot easier for me to just sort of dip into them and go. I'm going to create another little pool of some rose madder. Often for me this is brown madder, but I'm going to get into the brown madder later. So keeping it a little bit lighter on this first wash. And then the cobalt again, just freshen that up. So I have 3 little puddles. Let's see if you can see. So 3 little puddles there on my palette. Okay. Yeah. All right, so I'm just going to, with a damp brush, but not dripping, I'm going to start with make sure it's really clean. That's looking a little muddy. Start with the raw sienna and get some swaths of raw sienna down. I see here, when I'm looking here, I see this really lovely color in the front. And again, generally warm colors come forward, so I tend to be more generous with those in the foreground. I'm adding some of the rose madder into this because I do see tons and tons of pink in there. Lots of rosy colors in these rocks and the highlights of the rocks. With watercolor, you always have to add the light colors first because there is no going back. In fact, for me, often a lot of what I do in watercolor is not painting. So much of the painting in watercolor is just planning and preparing and really not a whole lot of painting at all. Okay, I'm just going back and forth now between raw sienna and the rose madder, just trying to get, again, we're not going to see any of this really. It's just for me to know these warm colors are here. And as I start to get into it, actually I want to even move it around like I did a little bit with the water. These are going to end up being the highlights really. And for those of you who do watercolor, you know how light paint dries. Even just sort of flicking some of the paint on here. Mixing it, letting it mix itself right on the palette. Again, just 2 colors right now. All I have are these 2 colors. Raw sienna and rose madder. Now, some of that has flicked into the sky. It's not even the sky, I'm sorry, the water, which is fine. Like I said before, I am gonna have to go over the water again with another wash to darken it. I can tell already. But for me, having been primarily an oil painter, I like to cover the page as quickly as possible. If I know I'm gonna have an area that's pure white, then I do leave that. But for the rocks, there really isn't gonna be any area of pure white. If I was gonna have splashing waves, then that would be left white. And I would plan that out way ahead of time. So just sort of moving it around, letting the colors combine on the page itself. And I haven't even touched the blue yet. I am going to get into the blues though. In fact, I do even like to, there's a little bit of a fuzz of the brush. There we go. All right, so that is drying-ish, sort of. Throw some more color on there. This is still really, really light color, really fine light wash. And I'm going to switch my brush now. Actually, no, I'm sorry. I'm going to add some of those blues in. I'm going to take advantage of where I know the shadows are going to be. So just wiping off extra paint. I know that there's going to be some heavy shadows along the back here and down in the very front. All those detailed shadows of outlining the rocks and highlighting them, I'm not going to get into just yet. And in fact, part of why it's important to have so much color down underneath, I'm going to not waste that drop there. While this is turned upside down, I'm going to flick on some of these blues. And it's still very, very light where there's the raw sienna, the cobalt is going to mix and be kind of green, and where there's the pink matter, it's going to mix and really make a nice purple. But we're going to add more. We're going to add a lot more. This is definitely a layered process, the way I paint these rocks. And I'm just completely ignoring the drawing I did. I can still see the pencil line through that, but again, so much of it is going to be covered up. And I'm just trying to get some really, just a lot of color on here. Because what I was saying before is when I start to scrape away, as I put darker colors down and scrape them back, the color that's going to be underneath is this color. And so I really want this to be beautiful. And I want it to be rich and have a lot under there. I don't want to scrape it back to plain white. That's not going to be as interesting. So much of these rocks here, to me, I just see endless color going on in these rocks. So I want to get that down here first. Okay, I'm going to wait a minute for this to dry and then get back in there with some darker colors. Okay, I'm back. It's dried a little bit, and also while it was drying, I got some new water, some new fresh water. I'm switching brushes too. I'm not using the mop anymore. Now I'm using an Escoda Perla brush. This has a much finer point, and I've used this a lot. It used to be white, but now it's full of all my lovely color. So what I'm going to do now is add in some of the darks, and I'm going to start. Again, this is a process. So I do this. It's very iterative. I do this over and over again until I get the rocks to look as I like. But I'll show you how I begin. So I'm going to a little bit deeper color. So now let's wipe this palette. Now I am going to get into the brown matter. So again, I'm just going to create myself a little puddle. The brown matter I really love. It's like a burnt sienna, but just so red, and I love it. I really love it. And I'm going to go for a deeper blue with an ultramarine. And these two together really give a nice purple. They're quite lovely. So the first wash was sort of lighter with the raw sienna, the rose madder, and the cobalt. And then this, now I'm going into a little bit of, just a little bit, oh, you still can't see, sorry about that. Ultramarine and brown matter. And I'm just gonna get them together. And this is too when I wanna have my credit card handy. So again, just keep going here, getting some good, nice color on here. I want it to mix itself a little bit. It's a little too red for me. Let's add some more. And I just sort of flick it on too, see where it goes. A lot of rocks for me are almost abstract, and they just happen. Okay, so I do want to get a bit of a shape here. This is still quite wet. I think I should have let it dry a little bit longer, but it will still work. Again, this is so, for me, I just go back and forth on this for so long, so it's okay if it's a little bit wet. We should be able to get a sense, though, from this. Just going back and forth between the brown matter and the ultramarine. Letting it mix itself a little bit here as we go. Once again, I like to turn it around. So now we'll see at this stage, it's still a little wet, but I'm going to give it a go anyway and do some scraping away. And when I scrape away, it does a couple things. One, at this stage, it's really going to just give texture. And as it dries a little more, when you scrape away, you'll really lift up the color and you'll be able to see the lighter underneath. So this is still just so wet. I'm gonna just dry this up a bit. Yeah, it's quite wet. Cold, damp day here in New England. Okay, so I'll just show you a little bit as I'm pulling the color. So it definitely is lifting the color at this point. I'm getting some nice lines, which I like. This is a good opportunity to really get some nice drawing in too. That top edge of the credit card is really getting some edges of this in here. I like these edges. And I'm getting the texture of the rough paper. So for me, painting rocks, you really need the rough paper because it lets that texture come through that looks like it's rocks. And of course, rocks are not uniform in any way. And these lines are to me, are just doing what's interesting to me right now. It's really going to be, when I get in later with the deep hues, that we're going to get a better sense of it. But, and you see that I picked up a ton of the color. But now I have underneath, you're seeing the first wash come through a little bit. And I'm getting some of this nice texture, and some of the upper edge of the credit card is giving some really nice lines. So I have wiped off quite a bit of this. So now what's really fun to do is go back in. Again, I'm using my ultramarine. I may dip into a little bit of the purple at this point. I don't always at this stage. Usually I save the purple for the very end when I really need to get some deep darks. But what happens now is it's sort of carved out these places for me that are just naturally rock edges. So I was intentional about where I use the credit card or the gift card, but I'm now left with some really lovely edges that aren't at all what I see on here, but are working for me in this painting. So it's just so wet. So I am trying to get some thicker paint on here. Well, see, that's the problem with using purple at this stage. It's just too purpley. So let's go back over that. Still, I need a little more brown matter. If you don't have brown matter, burnt sienna is really very, very similar in this situation. I just like the warm red that I get. Going back and forth now, just letting it bleed into itself. It won't go over where I pulled out the paint there. So that's nice. And just giving a bit of variety. I have some areas that are heavier on the warm brown matter, and some areas that are heavier on the ultramarine. Opportunity here, just sort of following along some of those lines that the credit card made to just make some rocks, make some rock shadows. I'm just sort of picking up where I had some lines, some of the edges, and creating shapes from those rocks. This is still so wet, so we're going to get layered and layered and layered here, but you still see the texture. I still can see some of my pencil lines underneath, which is fine. I don't mind that at all. I actually like that, sort of helping add to the texture. I just added a little cobalt here. As I'm going back, even though the contrast is quite great, it's going to be a little bit less. It's just the way perspective works and the way our eyes see color, is that they get less contrast as you go into, recede into the distance. So, and I'm still see the way this is, you've seen now this is almost fully dry. That all that raw umber, raw sienna and pink rose madder that we put on there has faded. It's really almost a pastel now. And so I'm just dipping and dabbing, and this is still so wet here that it's just mixing on the page itself. And I'm a little bit looking to this for reference, but mostly I'm just following what I see right here. I'm looking at this doesn't look like it quite has enough dimension to it. So I'm going to go in actually now to my Antwerp blue, and I really do see a little bit of green and warmer blues in there. So while this is still really wet and still able to mix, I'm just going to throw in some Antwerp blue, certain areas here, and see what happens. This is, again, still light enough, and the value is still light enough that if I don't like it, I can change it. That's not always the case in watercolor, but I've kept it light enough here that I can. Okay, so that's really where I'm going to leave it for this first stage. Now, if I don't like something I've done, for example, I do think that this section here probably should have been lighter. I like how the light color bleeds down in this image. The dark is much more of a smaller triangle, and the light bleeds down. So I've not done that. I've really almost made a stripe of dark here across the front. If I don't like that, say, I can really scrape it. Now, of course, it's not going back to white, but I can scrape away, again, using this credit card. And that's going to allow me to, when I do go back in with some darker darks in the front, that's not back to how it was, but it's going to be okay. All right, so let's take a minute for this to dry next and keep moving. Okay, gonna keep going. It's already been almost 20 minutes, so I've surpassed my allotted time, and as you can see, you can't get a lot done in 15 minutes on a demo, but I'm going to just move back a little bit. This color here is looking too cool for me, too bluish. I want this to be a warmer highlight, so I'm going to fix that right now while this is still drying. I'm going to actually use some of this brown matter that I have out here and throw that in, but that's much too dry. I don't want it to be a hard line, and again, this is still going to be my highlight color, so I'm going to also add some raw sienna while I'm there. So really this is just what we were doing in the beginning, but I'm just warming this up. This is still, remember, going to be a highlight, but it just is looking too pale and too cool for me here. And the rest of this is going to get painted over because it's going to be in shadow. Which is the nice thing about rocks, I think, because as long as you get a few that really look like rocks, the rest can just, they're almost abstract, you know, and I really like that. Okay, I think I warmed that up pretty well. Yeah, I feel better about that. Okay, and I'm gonna just get into here. Okay. This is still so wet that if I get it wet there, it's going to create a blossom, which I don't really want. Okay. While I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm gonna add some of my deeper darkers, again, back into the brown matter and ultramarine, and just really using those together. I might get into a little burnt sienna here too, because this is looking so purpley. Yeah, there we go, a little burnt sienna. And even this part here, I do want this to ultimately be in shadow. This is a nice little carved out piece of rock. So again, I'm just gonna let it paint itself. Watercolor has so many challenges, but so many wonderful things that it does as well. I like that. I like what's happening there. Again, anything I don't like, as long as it is light, I can always make it darker. I like this color here too. I'm actually going to go back in to what we had over here. And then I do see a really strong shape here that has a really nice shape. Again, once you get one or two rocks looking like rocks, the rest you can kind of fudge. And these I'm referring to the lines I drew originally on here. So I'm not really so much filling them in, but I'm using them as guides to help me. And these shadows are ultimately going to end up being quite a bit darker. But for now, this is acting as a nice guide for me to get in some big shapes. Okay, back to my credit card. I have some nice bleeding happening here. I really like that, but I do want to make sure I keep my shape. Now, you'll just play around with this and see where you get the lines and what kind of lines you get. And even this area that I've gone over before, I don't think there's going to be a lot of highlights in here, so I have left some. I'm going to pull that down. Still get a lot of texture. That is the lovely pull out right there. Okay. Well, I'm going to keep playing. This is going to take a little while. I'll keep going and check back in with you later. Thanks for watching the beginning of my rock demo. Let me see if I can get you a little bit closer. Oops. Okay, so here is where we are. You see a lot of that texture coming through on the rocks there. It's still pretty abstract, not a whole lot of obvious rocks going on, but I'm going to keep working, doing the same thing I did, using the credit card, using the color, carving out shapes. You can see already this area here that I added all that color back into is still dried so much lighter. So I'll try to share the finished image once I get there, or at least processes on the way. So thanks for joining me, everybody, and stay healthy.